let's do a test and then we'll do the thing. In fact, let's just do the thing. And we can tell whether, it might be 40 minutes down the drain, but I'm ready to go. How much did that mic cost you?
That's $20.
How much?
$20.
20?
Yeah.
That's a good deal. I paid 40 for a mic and it got stolen. These guys came to my house to put up boards for the storm. They said, we got to get in the house. I said, why? They said, we just got to. So I let them in the house. They stole my guitar, my mic, and what else? Guitar, mic. Those are the main things.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, these guys, man, you give them a chance. And then you can't call the police because you let them in the house, right? No signs of forced entry. No signs of forced entry. So I've got some money for you. I got $100, but we just have to do 2 episodes. 2 40-minute episodes. Should take about 2 hours and change. 2:30. Try not to get the microphone in the pictures.
Oh, it's still recording?
Well, yeah, we're still recording. I mean, you can, if it's not that obtrusive. Yeah, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Whatever you think is best. I should be closer. Like up here.
Okay, give me 5 minutes to look up how to use it.
So I'm just going to, while you're working on it, I'm going to talk about what we're going to do. So the first episode is Introduction to New Orleans. It's kind of just assuming that people don't know anything except maybe they've been here one time. They walked around the French Quarter. You don't have to pay any attention to me. You can work on that. And then they took the streetcar up St. Charles. They saw the beautiful houses. Maybe they visited the universities if they have kids there, or thinking about sending their kids there. So they really see a limited view. A lot of them seem to go into the Garden District across from, well, they wander around the Garden District, or they go to the cemetery across from Commander's Palace for some reason. There's nobody famous buried there. And so, this podcast will have a lot of elements. We got a history of, different people. The French, the Spanish. We got a few Cajuns came in here. And we're going to do one on food, history of the food in New Orleans. Where did the po' boy come from, all that stuff. And then the Louisiana Purchase is the second episode we're going to do today, after the introduction to New Orleans. And that's about Napoleon. What happened was, Napoleon was invited by the Spanish royalty to come send somebody to be the king of Spain. So he sent his brother Joseph over there. And then he figured out that he now owned all the Spanish possessions, so he decided to sell off Louisiana for $14 million. And because he didn't really care, he was in Europe, he didn't have ambitions on America. So he sold it, and some people think that it was, the documents were signed in the Cabildo downtown, Jackson Square, but in fact they were signed in Paris. So, if you studied history in Louisiana, they show you a map of what the Louisiana Purchase was. It's a big wedge in the middle of America. Doesn't include California, New Mexico, California, Nevada, New Mexico. And then there was also a dispute about where the border ended in the north. So we could have had Vancouver and British Columbia, but we ended up making a deal. That comes later. So after he bought the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson sent these guys called Lewis and Clark on an expedition. One was a major, one was a captain. And they had this Indian guide named Sacagawea, who was very young, and she was married to a Frenchman who was also along for the ride. And she was pivotal because she could talk to these Indians and make deals with them. And they made a lot of barters. The problem was they didn't have anything much to trade for these Indians. So they soon found out that they were relying on the charity of the Indians, to give them a couple of deer, give them a horse. They ate everything. They ate their horses. They ate, anything that you go out and scavenge, or anything you can shoot, you would eat. So the Louisiana Purchase expanded America, and then people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone were involved in it. There was a new state called Tennessee. So what happened is the original 13 colonies were on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. And then when the Louisiana Purchase went through, these settlers went across the Appalachians into Tennessee, Kentucky, and places like that. And, those frontier days, they were shooting bears and all that. There was all kinds of wildlife in those days. And we used to have trappers. The big deal was beaver, because they made hats out of beaver. And it was very fashionable in Europe for 40, 50 years. Everybody wanted a beaver hat, so they sold these beaver pelts. So then a later episode we're going to have in 3 parts is the New Orleans slave market, which existed up until 1861, when the Union troops occupied New Orleans, and they stopped selling slaves for some reason. So that episode, out of the 3 episodes, the middle episode we're going to do a historical reenactment. So I'm going to have voice actors playing the parts of the plantation owner, the plantation owner's wife, the slave driver guy, and a little 15-year-old black slave from Georgia. So I'm doing those, casting those voice parts. I've got one woman that seems to know what she's doing. Everybody sees this ad for voice actors in the Craigslist, and they think, I've got a voice, I can do it. It's kind of stupid. But this woman is actually, she's got a reel, she's done acting before. And so I'm counting on her to do the accents. But I still need a male, and I'm thinking today, I was thinking maybe I should do it. I should voice the male. The male parts are the plantation owner and the slave driver. But I'd have to study the Louisiana aristocratic accent. Where I live uptown, there's a lot of people that talk like that. Are you getting audio and everything? Yeah. Okay. Let's just do it then. Like I said, we might waste 40 minutes. We'll do the 40 minutes and then we'll see, play back, and if it's fine, we'll do another episode. So let me know when you're ready. Just go 3, 2, 1. Just count me down, 3, 2, 1. Hello, welcome to the first episode of the New Orleans History Podcast. I'm Rob, I'm going to be your host for probably 100 episodes, and then later on we'll do more as things develop. So we're going to go all the way from the original colonization of Louisiana all the way up to the present day, and maybe speculate about the future. So the first episode is about just a general introduction to New Orleans. So those of you who've been here, and I know this is a worldwide audience, and some of you never have been and you never will be, but there's a lot of people that visit here. There's conventions held every year for certain groups, like certain groups of doctors, lawyers, come here every year, and so they would say, I'll see you in New Orleans, if they run into them. So most tourists start in the French Quarter. That's changed a little bit because of Airbnb. Sometimes they end up in weird neighborhoods. But they go to the French Quarter, they wander around, they have beignets, they see the river, they go to the French market, and they look at the houses, which some of them are quite old, the oldest houses in New Orleans. Then generally they go to the Garden District, they ride the trolley uptown, and they get off at the Garden District around Washington Avenue. They may go to the cemetery that's across from Commander's Palace. I tell them not to go because there's nobody famous there, but it's a tourist thing. They have guides that walk them around the houses of the Garden District, and you can get books. There's a bookstore called Garden District Bookshop. You go in there, they have all kind of books about it. So what I'm trying to do in this podcast is expand your knowledge to all the neighborhoods of New Orleans. Some of them are bad neighborhoods that you may not want to go in. But there's a lot of creative fervor here. We have, on any given night, we have about 150 live music venues. Some of them you wouldn't want to go in. They're dangerous parts of town. There's lots of places you can hear live music. We're famous as the birthplace of jazz. Also, some people argue we're the birthplace of rock and roll because we had guys like Chubby Checker who did rock and roll a long time ago before anybody else. Also, there was a show in Louisiana, not in New Orleans, called the Louisiana Hayride, and they had guests like Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, all those people early in their career. Of course, you know Memphis is a big center of that early rock and roll, rockabilly, all that stuff. So I just want to introduce you to some other neighborhoods. So if you go, take the trolley and you go all the way uptown, you can get off in what's called Carrollton. It used to be its own city. It has a Carrollton Courthouse, which is near the river bend, which is the trolley takes a right turn when it goes up to Carrollton Avenue. And right there, there's a Carrollton Courthouse, which they're not doing anything with. It's been a school, it's been different things. So you go to Carrollton and you can explore a bit, but watch out because if you get too far off Carrollton Avenue, you're in a dangerous neighborhood. There's one place where they found $50 million under a guy's house. There's 14 people in jail for murder, for being in that neighborhood and shooting each other over drugs and God knows what else. So some other neighborhoods that you might want to explore, the Irish Channel. So that's between Magazine and Tchoupitoulas. So when you're going, instead of taking the trolley, if you take the Magazine bus from downtown and you get off at like Caddis, Valence Street, something like that. Or you can go all the way up to Robert and Sonia and Dufasset. Anyway, that part of town is called the Irish Channel, and it's because the Irish immigrants that worked on the river built little tiny houses there, and they decorated them with what's called gingerbread, which is carved wood in the facades. So we're gonna have to edit some of this out because of the noise, but I'm gonna keep going. So you can explore the Irish Channel. It's very exciting. They have a bar called Parasols. You can go over there and get drunk and eat po' boy sandwiches. There's a famous po' boy place called Domalice's, and there's a place called Guy's Po' Boys. A po' boy these days, a decent one, is going to cost you $15 for a shrimp or oyster. Another big place to explore is Mid-City. So it used to be the blue-collar, white working-class part of town where people that were, plumbers, and they did construction, and they did various manual labor jobs. They had trucks and all that. And they created this white neighborhood in Mid-City. And that was one of the places I lived when I was going to Tulane. Anyway, it's really developed now, and they have Irish bar, and they have restaurants, and you can really have a good time out there. And people who live in Mid-City never leave Mid-City, and that's true also of Uptown, where I live, which is near the universities. So Uptown theoretically goes from, I don't know, perhaps maybe Napoleon Avenue, certainly Jefferson Avenue, all the way up to Carrollton Avenue. But the good part of Uptown is the part that's on the downtown side of the universities, and those houses are average of about $800,000. So that's considered safe, and they have a patrol that goes around, harasses people that don't seem to live there. Other neighborhoods you might want to explore, there's a famous restaurant called Dooky Chase. It's in a really bad neighborhood, but if you take a taxi there and you go in and out, you might be all right. There was a famous black settlement along Claiborne Avenue at one time when they built the interstate highway and kind of obliterated it. But you could go back and look at pictures of how it was. It was a gathering place for black people. I had trees and I had shops, and people had picnics and all that. And they had their own little thing over there, completely ruined by the interstate. So those are a few neighborhoods you can explore. And it goes endlessly. You've got the 9th Ward, the upper 9th Ward, the lower 9th Ward. Brad Pitt built some houses there after Katrina, which are all falling apart. And the people that own them are trying to sue him because he's worth probably $300 million. Anyway, so that's what we're going to be talking about. So that's our introduction to New Orleans, and I'm going to go ahead and stop it here because the next episode is the Louisiana Purchase. That's the end of episode 1. Don't even play it back if you think you got it. Let's just go on to episode 2.
Okay.
Think you got it?
Hey guys.
Okay. Let's go on to episode 2. Just count it down, 3, 2, 1.
A little bit close.
Welcome to the New Orleans History Podcast. I'm your host, Rob. We're now on episode 2, which is about the Louisiana Purchase. That was a big epic event in New Orleans history because New Orleans had belonged to the French. New Orleans had belonged to the French and then the Spanish, and then at the Louisiana Purchase, where Napoleon sold Louisiana to Jefferson, New Orleans became the most important port in the United States because it was situated at the bottom of the Mississippi River. And in those days, there weren't interstate highways. Everything was traveled by water. So goods would come down to New Orleans and then be shipped abroad. Goods would come into New Orleans and be shipped up the river. There's a huge river trade. And you've heard of riverboats, steamboats, all that stuff. So the Louisiana Purchase occurred because the Spanish monarchy was in chaos. They were fighting out over who should be king, and they were all incompetent and idiots. So they decided to invite Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the emperor of France at the time, invite him to send a king to be the king of Spain. So he sent his brother Joseph there. Joseph didn't like it. He had been the king of Naples, which is based in Naples and a kingdom of the two Sicilies. And he had a good time down there, but he agreed, or New Orleans, or Napoleon more or less forced him to come and be king of Spain. And he had a rough time because they had started guerrilla warfare against him. If you ever heard of guerrilla warfare? That's a Spanish term, and it means these people that hit and run. So they would attack the French forces and kill a bunch of people and then take off. They wouldn't even confront them. But when they were captured, they were executed. They were killed by firing squad. And there's famous paintings by Goya that show them being executed, the Spanish patriots, by the French army. The French army ended up having to fight for the Spanish peninsula, which is called Iberia, and they suffered terrible defeats from the Duke of Wellington. And that's later on. So the Louisiana Purchase cost $14 million and included New Orleans and included this big piece of the United States. And if you take history in Louisiana, they'll show you a big map where there's this wedge that's maybe 2/5 maybe of what the United States is. A big wedge that includes, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky. And once we owned Louisiana, the President Jefferson sent a couple of guys that he trusted to scout it out, and that was called the Lewis and Clark Expedition. I think it was Major Clark and Captain Lewis. And they had, with them they had a woman called Sacagawea, who was about 22 years old, and she was married to a Frenchman. And she basically saved their bacon because she could speak several languages and she negotiated with the Indians. So the Lewis and Clark expedition was on the brink of starvation a lot of times because they found out that the goods that they brought to trade with the Indians were worthless to the Indians. So they ended up just living on charity and having the Indians bring them a horse to eat or a couple of deer, just because the Indians felt sorry for them. Anyway, back to New Orleans. So New Orleans became the most important port and the richest port in the United States. And immediately, people from up north came down to try to make their fortune on the river trade. When they got to Louisiana, they tried to buy property in the French Quarter to live and set up their shops and businesses, but they found to their horror that the people that lived there, who were French and Spanish and had their own culture, they had a French opera house, for example, which unfortunately burned down later. Anyway, they didn't want no part of these Americans, these Anglos. So they wouldn't sell them any land or any businesses. They wouldn't sell their houses. So they decided to establish their own neighborhood where each house would be on like a city block, be right